So I want to welcome all of you to the extension track session. This is Demystifying the WASDE Outlook Process, Part 2. My name is Brian Adam, Chief of the Crops Branch at USDA Economic Research Service in the Market and Trade Economics Division. And the first one of this session was on Monday in person at AAEA. This session, Part 2, expands on Part 1 in demystifying the WASDE Outlook process. In the previous session, several analysts described key parts of their Outlook responsibilities, participating in the Interagency Commodity Estimates Committee meetings, leading to the release of the World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimates, or WASDE. In this presentation, we want to drill down and give several examples of how the WASDE process incorporates new market information into its estimates. So we're going to go through several case studies: Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the highly pathogenic avian influence in poultry, rise of biodiesel and renewable diesel, the effects on oilseed markets, fertilizer and transportation markets, and then capturing the effects of La Nina. And so first presentation is going to be a brief overview of the WASDE Outlook process by Mark Jekanowski, Office of the Chief Economist and the Chair of the World Agricultural Outlook Board. The case study 1 is going to be presented by Andrew Soll, Senior Wheat Analyst in ERS, Market and Trade Economics Division. And then case study 2, the highly pathogenic avian influenza in poultry, will be presented by Grace Grossen, Poultry Analyst, also in ERS MTED. And then case study 3, the rise of biodiesel and renewable diesel, its effect on oilseed markets, will be presented by Aaron Aites, Oil Crops Analyst, USDA Economic Research Service, MTED. And case study 4, fertilizer and transportation markets, by Angelica Williams, International Feed Grains Analyst in ERS MTED. And then case study 5 will be presented by Mark Brusberg, Chief Meteorologist, Office of the Chief Economist, also with the World Agricultural Outlook Board. And then we will have a time for questions and answers. And so I'll try to be looking at the questions coming in on the question and answers part, if any of you have any. And then we'll have an opportunity, of course, for just live questions and answers. So our first presentation will be Dr. Mark Jekanowski, Chairman of the World Agricultural Outlook Board. Mark, give us a brief review of the WASDE process.
All right. Thank you, Brian, and good morning, everybody. Great to have you here with us today. And thank you, Brian, too, for organizing this session. I think this is really valuable information for the folks who use the WASDE and are interested in the kind of information we put out. So as Brian noted, I'm going to give a really quick overview of the WASDE process, how the information comes together. For people who joined the session on Monday, this will be completely a review. For those who didn't, the idea is just to give a little bit of a background about the WASDE. All of the case studies that follow my presentation are focused on the WASDE and focused on those discussions and the analyses that go into the WASDE numbers. So I hope to just kind of set the stage for how all of these numbers and analyses come together. Brian, go ahead and advance the slide. So real quick, so I'm chairman of the World Agricultural Outlook Board. It's a small agency, part of the Office of Chief Economist, a relatively new agency compared to others across USDA. We were established in 1977. And one of the things that we are primarily known for is putting out the WASDE report. And as I noted, we're a small agency, about 20 people on staff. And that includes 5 meteorologists, one of whom you'll hear from later in this session. But each of those meteorologists are responsible for covering weather developments and crop prospects in particular regions of the world, and they They watch those weather developments on a daily basis and update their yield models and their production forecasts based on real-time weather information as it is coming in. So again, we're a small agency, but that the 20 people that are on staff at the World Board is a vast underestimate of the number of people that actually contribute to putting the WASDE together. Ultimately, the World Board serves as is basically a coordinating agency, collecting information and expertise from across USDA every month to get these estimates in shape and out the door. Go ahead and advance it one more slide. So the basic process that we follow, and which you're going to hear more about during the case study discussions, is known as the Interagency Commodity Estimates Committee process. And the World Board is set up to be the chair. We have a specific chairperson for each of 9 ICEC committees, which are listed there on the right side of the screen. So each major committee has a chair as part of the World Board, and participants from the different ICEC agencies, and those include the Economic Research Service, of course, the Foreign Ag Service, the Agricultural Marketing Service, and the Farm Production and Conservation Business Center, also known as FPAC, which is basically associated with FSA and the policy arm of USDA. And each one of these agencies brings either unique expertise or unique data to the discussion process that leads to establishing the numbers that are reported each month in the WASDE. And every month, essentially, almost every number that is reported in the WASDE is subject to debate and reanalysis based on new information. Go ahead and advance my screen once. So to kind of visualize the process, as you can see there, the ICEC, the committee, again, it's chaired by the World Board with input from the 4 agencies I listed or mentioned earlier, listed below there. And the one other agency that's an important contributor to the WASDE, but that isn't actually a part of the ICEC process, is NASS, the National Agricultural Statistics Service. Now, I noted earlier that nearly every number in the WASDE is subject to debate and analysis within this ICEC committee process. The only numbers that aren't subject to debate are the production numbers that we receive from NASS. So NASS acreage estimates for all of the major commodities, yield estimates when they're available from NASS. Those data go directly into the WASDE. As is, we typically receive them the morning that the WASDE is released, and we receive those numbers in lockup, and then all of the other components of the balance sheet have to adjust in response to that information that we get from NASS. The reason that NASS numbers aren't open for debate, well, there's a few reasons for it, but basically, I mean, that NASS information is viewed as the gold standard in terms of U.S. production data, and the crop production report itself is a principal federal economic indicator. So those are official USDA statistics, just like the WASDE numbers that we put out at the same time. So go ahead and advance one more. The WASDE, again, for folks who might not be fully familiar, we follow a full balance sheet approach to putting out our estimates. So basically, we're looking at all of the components of supply and all of the components of demand, both for domestic and foreign, both for crops and livestock produced domestically and in foreign markets. It's important to think of the full balance sheet in regard to the WASDE numbers to give context, knowing that, you know, without knowing how supply and demand balance, information that, for example, that supplies are increasing, production is increasing, it doesn't mean as much unless you also know how supplies are changing relative to demand. Is the market tightening up, or is the market developing excess stocks? That is what ultimately determines price, and that is really what the goal of the WASDE is, to give that sense of how tight or how loose markets are and what the expectations are for how supply and demand balance. So clearly there's a lot of data involved on both the production side and the demand side. And ultimately, to get supply and demand to balance, every balance sheet has some component of a residual or unobserved variable as well, just reflecting the fact that it's virtually impossible to fully account for every demand component of a commodity, for example, or there could be minor errors in a lot of the data, the production data or the demand data. So that residual component is what helps the balance sheet, what ultimately forces the balance sheet to balance. But typically, we try to keep the residual as small as possible by accounting for all of the demand components for which we have good data. I'll go ahead and advance one more slide there. So in terms of the timing of the WASDE, again, as you probably are aware, the WASDE comes out every single month, and every month is a new assessment of the supply and demand outlook for the entire crop year. The first official estimates for the new crop year always come out in May. So in May, we start to report on the crops that will ultimately be harvested later in the summer or in the fall and marketed through the following summer. And then as new information comes available during the marketing year, throughout the marketing year, those forecasts are updated up to the point where once we get toward the end of the marketing year, they are converging on what ultimately becomes the truth. Obviously, there's a lot more uncertainty early in the year, and that uncertainty diminishes as the data and market conditions are realized throughout the rest of the year. Also, just worth noting, even though our first official forecasts go out in May, we also put out some very preliminary, unofficial non-WASDE forecasts in February. We released those at the Ag Outlook Conference. And then those help to serve the basis for the analyses that are released a few months later in May. Go ahead and my last slide here. Speaking of the Ag Outlook Conference, just wanted to put up a little plug for that. It will be coming up February 15th and 16th of next year. Hope you can attend. It's going to be in person here in Washington, D.C. But if you can't attend in person, it will also be live streamed. So hope to see you there. and also included there just a few links of where you can find information, where we post the WASDE, and a little bit more information about the Ag Outlook Forum. So with that, I will hand it back to you, Brian, and let the other presenters talk in more detail about the specific case studies.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate that nice overview of the WASDE process. And now we're going to take a deeper dive into some of the work that goes on behind the scenes in those ISIC committee meetings and even before, as the analysts do their pre-meeting analysis. And so our first case study is looking at the Russian invasion of Ukraine and everything that happened from that. Andy Soul is going to do a presentation on that, and looking forward to hearing what Andy has to say about how ISIC responded to the Ukraine events.
All right, thank you very much. And I'll share my screen here in a moment and then get going. But yeah, my name's Andrew Soul, also known as Andy. I go by either. I'm going to talk through this Russia-Ukraine case study. I'm going to talk through, a discussion of the events themselves and how it affected the markets, but also how USDA looked at it. And my focus is most specifically on wheat, but I'm going to discuss some other commodities as well. So here I show general timeline of events and projections. So first, the war broke out in February 2022. Ukraine's ports were closed. In March of that year, USDA in its WASDE report focused on the first impacts for the ongoing marketing year, 21-22, and the WASDE contained the note, Russia's recent military action in Ukraine significantly increased the uncertainty of agricultural supply and demand conditions in the region and globally. The March WASDE represents an initial assessment of the short-term impact as a result of this action. In May of that year, WASDE projections were released, providing the first view of the new marketing year, 22-23 at that point, which was the first marketing year to begin in a state of war. Winter wheat was planted before the conflict, but corn and the other summer grains were planted during the conflict. Export situation was still uncertain at that point, with the ports closed. In July, the Black Sea Grain Initiative was signed, allowing for exports from Odessa, Chornomorsk, and Yuzhny ports. This agreement was signed with Turkey and the United Nations. It allowed Russia to inspect the ships and resulted in a strong boost to Ukraine's grain shipments. The initial agreement, I believe, was 120 days, then successively extended as time went on. Notably, though, the pace of shipments dropped off as Russia was slowing inspections down later. May of this year, WASDE figures were published for the 23-24 marketing year under a much different landscape than a year earlier. So here's a view of the initial impacts of the war on Ukraine's 21-22 exports. And bear in mind that production of that crop was not affected at all since it was harvested in 21. Exports are generally front-loaded on its July through June marketing year, so much of the expected exports were already shipped by the time the war started. Assumptions had to be made for the pace of shipments in the remaining months. And with exports largely shut off and limited to land routes with Europe, our export projection dropped from 24 down to 20, and then eventually ended up around 18.8. There was also some uncertainty around Russia's exports regarding, in the midst of war, but ultimately that forecast was not changed as substantially. So what about prices? Well, here's a chart of note ERS put out in April of last year discussing the price effects of the war. See, the conflict in the Black Sea didn't only affect prices in that region, the higher prices spilled over to the world market. Ukraine's ability to ship was in question, and really the continuity of Russia's exports was an unknown at the time, given sanctions and other war impacts. By early 2022, before the war even started, wheat prices were already elevated, with, at least in the US, with drought having impacted spring white and durum wheat in the previous year. And the Ukraine conflict only sent these prices even higher. The largest year-on-year increases, looking at March, the data we're looking at, the largest percentage increases were for hard red winter and soft red winter, as these are the classes, they're lower price, so from a lower base, but also more comparable to the wheat flows that were being disrupted in the Black Sea. So I mentioned earlier that due to differing production timelines, wheat and corn were affected by the conflict differently. Here's a look at our initial projections for 22-23 from May of last year. Wheat and barley planted before the conflict were initially projected down 23% and 37% respectively. Corn, on the other hand, had to be planted in the spring after conflict had already started. So production of that crop was initially projected down by 51%. Oilseeds were less dramatically affected in total. Sunflower seed specifically was still preferable crop driven by record sunflower oil pricing. And so it was down less substantially. So talking about initial production forecasts for Ukraine, here's a broad overview of how those figures were arrived at. It was initially anticipated destruction and abandonment rate in the oblasts that were located in conflict zones would be at 30%. Due to the ongoing war, however, there's no official and reliable information about the status of Ukraine's ag in the conflict zones. Figures were later updated as Ukraine's Statistics Service published its final crop estimates for 22-23, which did not include occupied territories. For USDA's production figures now, currently occupied territories are still not counted in the total except for Crimea. So let's ask the question, how have estimates of these production figures changed over time? Each month, WASDE data represents USDA's best estimates given the uncertainty of the ongoing situation. So here's a view of production expectations for both countries from initial in May of 2022 to the latest data, July of this year. Ukraine's production total has ended up right where we started at 21.5 million tons. In spite of many constraints, harvest was able to continue in the unoccupied regions of the country. Russia, on the other hand, has seen its production skyrocket from an initial estimate of about 80 to 92, which is a record. And once again, we aren't including currently occupied oblasts in production totals for either country. There's no reliable data. Neither country's ag ministries report on those areas now, but at least explicitly. And Russia does report on Crimea, however, and USDA statistics are adjusted to account for that production in Ukraine. Here's a similar chart as the last one, but for exports. Now, this one tells an interesting development. As the year progressed, Russia's export estimates rose from 39 all the way up to 45.5 million tons, mainly the result of expanding supplies. As estimates of the crop got bigger, Russia's export prices became the most competitive in the world, and their pace was very rapid. Ukraine's export forecast also increased steadily throughout the year. Initially forecast at 10 million tons without any certainty for shipments via the Black Sea. And then that increased to 11 in August, shortly after the Black Sea Grain Initiative came into place. But understanding its effect on the market was still not assured. As shipments continued, the pace of exports was monitored and gradually raised to 16.8 million tons, where it is now. Now, an interesting dynamic regard to the timing of exports between corn and wheat, I'll show from a chart of note from January of this year. So a quick explanation, the shaded areas are corn and wheat exports for each month, the 5-year average for each month, corn in gray, wheat in yellow. And then the bars are the observed export pace for 2022. So the blue is corn and the green is wheat. So during the months of August and September, we see in the shaded yellow area, wheat exports are normally the larger export item during that time of year. This makes sense as wheat should be the dominant export item right after it's harvested and before corn is harvested. But in 2022, this changed as corn shipments seen in the blue bars were actually the first to make a major move with the opening of the export corridor. And this occurred because corn shipments were backlogged and already at points of export from earlier in the year. Thus, wheat shipments that year, the green bars, were delayed a few months in getting going significantly. This dynamic, along with uncertainty regarding the continuity of the corridor itself, made it particularly tricky to see the impact of the Black Sea Grain Initiative in the early months. It's hard to make a forecast when the initial pace is slow and the long-term policy is uncertain. What does all of this mean for importers? So this is a graphic from our January Wheat Outlook feature article, and there's a link available at the end of the presentation. But without going into depth, the key point here is that more Ukraine wheat and corn shipments went to Europe in 2022 and less to other destinations. So this is problematic for some of the developing countries that previously relied on Ukraine's exports. The larger shipments to EU were partly for logistical reasons, limited ability to export by sea, and also due to drought in the EU. This eventually led to some dissatisfaction in some of the Eastern member states who imposed bans, but now the agreement is that Ukrainian grain can transit through those countries, but not stay in those border countries specifically. Returning to the topic of prices. So earlier we discussed the surge in wheat pricing that occurred from the start of the war. The war caused massive uncertainty and volatility in the marketplace, all three commodities affected, but wheat most substantially. We see that starting in February 2022, prices rose to historic highs, reaching a peak in May. And also feeding the high prices in wheat at that point were drought conditions in hard red winter areas in the middle of the US. But as winter wheat harvests has started, prices declined for a few months. Prices have had various movements since then, with corn and soy being generally below pre-war levels. HRW specifically is somewhat elevated due to ongoing drought for the second year in a row. And there's also been a price bump recently with markets reacting to attacks on Ukraine's port. So production expectations for wheat and corn and for this marketing year, 23-24, were set well below the level of the previous year for both corn and wheat. Production levels for those commodities were projected well below recent history as well, with lost territory being a major factor. Similarly, exports for corn and wheat have been projected well below last year and the recent average, partly driven by smaller crop, as well as uncertainty for how shipments will proceed given the expiration of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Going over a few other ramifications of the conflict, both the material flow of trade and the ability to track market developments, Russia's no longer reporting monthly export data as they previously did. Analysts have had to patch together various sources such as vessel data, making even final data less clear to interpret. Ukraine's shipments have been monitored using data tracked by the United Nations for the Black Sea Grain Initiative. So that one detail has actually gotten more transparent. Initial price surges have subsided and some commodities now trading lower than at the start of the conflict. Long-term effects on Ukraine's agriculture hard to decipher, but our assumptions are for status quo to continue in terms of how the war and everything is. A few closing thoughts. The war between Russia and Ukraine has had a major impact on global grains markets with a large temporary price surge. Ukraine's exports were initially minimal, later expanded with the opening of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, but the future's uncertain with that having expired. Recent news of further attacks on Ukraine's port infrastructure have also contributed to price increases, but it's nothing like what was observed in February through May of last year. We've seen shifts in Ukraine's export destinations in the last year, with more having gone to Europe and less to other destinations, but this could change partly based on supply and demand dynamics in Europe. Uncertainty is a major factor in forecasting for Ukraine and in general, given the changing landscape and added complexity of analyzing trade flows. A few resources available for reference regarding historical USDA forecasts on these topics. You can always refer to the latest WASDE, to the ERS wheat data, or to the FAS production, supply, and distribution databases for the latest data. Also, ERS has a trending topics page related to this. You can connect with ERS on social media. I want to thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you, Andy. And I should point out, if you have questions or comments, please jot them down so you don't forget them, and we'll definitely take time to address those at the end of all the presentations. So I'm going to share my screen and introduce our next presenter. Okay. Grace Grossen is going to talk about HPI, doing a little switch over from crops to the animal side. And Grace is an analyst in the Market and Trade Economics Division of Economic Research Service. So Grace, go ahead and begin.
Thank you, Brian. Like Brian said, I'm talking about how the development of the 2022 HPAI outbreak impacted monthly WASDE projections for turkeys and for eggs. Next slide. So the first thing I wanted to cover was some basic assumptions that we go into every meeting with. We always assume that the policy in place at the time of publication is going to stay in place. This is most notable when it comes to trade restrictions. And in terms of the outbreak, we do not assume that it continues. We make all of our adjustments to future production expectations based on existing flock data and assumed recovery times with losses that have already been recorded. This is because we don't forecast the spread of disease. Next slide. So starting with turkeys, this slide gives us a snapshot of the outbreak over time, starting in February and going all the way through April of this year. And it also demonstrates, I think, the usefulness of the APHIS data, the data on the outbreak from the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service that came out just about every day, which reported every confirmed HPAI case. We use a range of public USDA data to generate our outlook figures. These include the NAS production data and cold storage, as well as AMS weekly and monthly prices and preliminary weekly production figures from AMS, but all of these things are lagged. The NAS production data is a couple of months behind the WASDE month, is 2 months behind the WASDE month. Our prices are 1 month behind the WASDE month. So what this means is that any decline in production that would be implied by these case numbers from APHIS isn't actually confirmed until a couple of months later. So this headline number on the slide is 9.4 million turkeys. That represents about 2.5 weeks of slaughter. But of course, it's not as if we just stopped slaughtering turkeys for 2 weeks. The losses were spread out over time, and the impacts of the losses were not all immediate. So next slide. I'm going to zoom in on the steepest part of this chart.
Sorry, it's not
Oh no,
advancing for me. So let me stop sharing again and try to move. Sorry about that.
no worries.
Now let's share again.
Okay, thank you, Brian.
Mm-hmm.
So we're zooming in on the April WASDE because it had the biggest adjustment to turkey production and expectations all year. Annual production was cut by 150 million pounds. Between the March WASDE release on the 9th and the April release on April 8th, total turkey losses ballooned from about 344,000 to 3.3 million birds. And at this time, we had actual NAS data for January and February, but not yet for March. We could still adjust the first quarter estimate, but we didn't much. Although those losses were in March, we decreased production by the largest margin in the second quarter, as well as pulling down the third and fourth quarters. Turkeys take about 4 months to grow out, and that APHIS data does not include the ages of the birds that are lost. So it's difficult to tell exactly when the birds were originally slated for slaughter, but based on our preliminary March slaughter data, we did not see the impact in March and pulled out of later quarters. Next slide. This slide shows some of the impacts we ended up seeing in turkeys throughout the year. On the left-hand side, we've got average weights, which fell off beginning of the spring. This is partially because as younger birds were pulled forward to replace birds that were lost in the production chain, those average weights dropped. Overall, production was knocked down by both lower weights and lower slaughter numbers. Total turkey slaughter in 2022 in birds, in terms of birds, was down 3%, whereas there's a 6% drop in production in pounds. The right-hand chart shows how the bird losses, especially in that first wave, were somewhat delayed in their impact on production. You can see July has the largest year-over-year drop in production while having minimal HPAI cases in that month. So next slide, we're moving on to eggs. So here we've got a bird's eye view of the egg layer losses over time, this time showing losses on a monthly rather than daily basis. This chart stops in December, as there's not been another case in laying hens since December 20th. The most laying hens were lost in March and April, but cases did continue in the fall after having none at all in the month of July. Next slide. So as you may notice on the left-hand chart, cases in egg layers were less frequent than those in turkeys, but the size of the operations is much larger. The vast majority of all birds lost during the 2022 outbreak were laying hens. And I'm focusing on the changes to WASDE price projections in March, April, and May. The March WASDE had already projected 15% higher average prices in 2022 as compared to 2021, as prices were above average even in the first couple of months of the year. They began to climb counter-seasonally starting in April. By the time of publication of the April WASDE, layer losses already totaled almost 19 million hens, representing 5.7% of the laying flock inventory at the start of the year. And this is just the losses from February and March at this point. The April WASDE confirmed the first quarter average price at 170.8 cents per dozen, and the outlying quarters were adjusted up by 23, 25, and 20 cents respectively. A much larger adjustment came in May after April prices averaged 272 cents per dozen, and the flock had lost another 9 flocks amounting to 10.6 million birds in April. So at the time, assuming there would be no more outbreaks beyond the ones we already knew about, and the quarterly prices were adjusted up in the May WASDE, but they were still expected to fall through the rest of the year. That is not what ended up happening. Next slide, please. So layer losses did continue through the year, and the flock was very slow to recover. And after outbreaks continued to happen in the fall and early December, strong demand for eggs at the holiday baking season combined with short supply to result in eggs over $5 a dozen at wholesale in December. The fourth quarter average price ended up being 411.7 cents per dozen, more than $2 above the price projected back in May. A bump in prices leading up to winter holidays and Easter and Passover holidays is typical, but the rise in prices in late 2022 dwarfed even the spike at the start of the outbreak, when it also coincided with Easter. Next slide, please. So this slide is focused on lay rates. Saw an interesting pattern in lay rates in 2022. It's because at the beginning of the year, the flock was relatively young. And as the outbreak progressed, the birds that were left behind reached peak productivity, leading to year-over-year higher lay rates. So as a result, the impact of flock losses was dampened until those birds aged past their peak later in the year. Those lay rates began to fall closer to 2021 levels at the end of the year and fell year-over-year in December. And this contributed to that supply and demand imbalance that led to historically high prices. So next, I'm going to go over the current situation for turkeys and eggs, just briefly. Next slide. Thank you. So the turkey situation right now, to wrap up 2022, while turkey production was lousy in 2022, falling 6%, Thanksgiving was not ruined. There was a buildup of table hens in cold storage in preparation for the holiday. While it was still below this 5-year average that you see on that dotted line, it was well above the previous year. An additional thing that helped domestic supply was some products staying in the US market that might have usually been exported. In 2021, about 10% of turkey production was exported, but that share was down to about 8% in 2022. In absolute terms, we exported about 140 million pounds less in 2022 than 2021. In 2023, production is projected to improve, increasing by 4.4% from 2022. But it's expected to take until 2024 to climb back above 2021 levels. Next slide. This shows our egg price situation right now. They have declined since the start of 2023 in the absence of outbreaks since December, although this was interrupted by a seasonal bump in prices leading up to Easter 2023. Our daily New York egg price has been steady at 123 cents per pound, or cents per dozen, excuse me, since the end of May. And this is because the availability of eggs is improving at a time when demand is at a seasonal low. For 2023, the annual average price forecast is 181.7 cents per dozen, and that's down 36% from last year's average. 2024's average price forecast is 144 cents per dozen, down even further. So that's the end of my slides. Thank you very much for listening.
Yeah, and the presenter for this is Aaron Ates, oil crops analyst in the Market and Trade Economics Division. So thank you, Aaron.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Yeah, my name's Aaron Ates. Work for ERS, and like Mark talked about, I'm a member of the Oilseeds ISIC committee, so help develop the projections each month for our WASDE report. After WASDE is released here at ERS, we also release a report a few days later that provides a little more detailed insight into kind of the current structure of the markets and kind of explain why certain changes were not made to the balance sheets in the WASDE. And so if you follow commodity markets, especially oil seeds, you know, biofuels are a very hot topic. And so today I'm going to talk about biofuels, the impacts on oil seed markets, how this fits into the balance sheets we published by USDA and WASDE. Next slide, please.
Again, stop not moving forward. Let me try again.
Okay.
And if we need to, we'll go. How's that? Can you see that?
No, no.
Okay.
Okay. All right, so yeah, I just want to start out by showing you all like a very brief history of the relationship between a few biofuels of major importance in the oilseed complex. And so when I'm talking about biofuels today, I'm talking about renewable diesel, which is denoted here as RND, and biodiesel, otherwise known as fatty acid methyl ester, denoted as FAME here. And you can see that in early 2021 and throughout most of that year, there's a pretty big difference in RND and FAME production. As we went through 2022 and even at the end of 2022, renewable diesel production surpassed FAME production. In large part, this is due to federal mandates and state incentive programs, specifically the Renewable Fuel Standard and California's Low Carbon Fuel Standard. Next slide, please, Brian. Okay, so as part of the RFS, EPA has implemented renewable fuel standards. The final ruling was released a few weeks ago, and much like Grace mentioned, USDA operates with policy in place. And so prior to the final ruling, the policy in place was outlined in EPA's proposed renewable volume obligations. So with that in mind, this table is very helpful in serving as a starting point for analyses and forecasting. All values in this table are expressed in billions of RINs, except the second line for biomass-based diesel, which is a gallon requirement. So this is billions of gallons. But using this table, you can come up with a total RIN estimate for each calendar year or range across marketing years. So RINs it's a renewable identification number, and basically EPA said a certain amount of these have to be generated each calendar year. And so if you use this table, you can arrive at an estimate that would represent your total biofuel production necessary to fulfill the mandate. And after you have this estimate, many other factors need to be considered in kind of a quasi simultaneous manner. And what I mean by that, for instance, you need to know what portion of the RINs will be fulfilled with renewable diesel and FAME production. So for every gallon of renewable diesel produced, 1.7 RINs are generated, but 1.5 RINs for every gallon of FAME produced. And now as an economist, we're aware that trade-offs exist, and this really is no exception. And so although renewable diesel production generates a little more, a few more RINs, it typically requires a larger volume of feedstocks to produce 1 gallon than does FAME. So some trade-offs there. But also to produce biofuels, we need some feedstocks, right? So it is imperative to consider which feedstocks can and will be used to produce biofuels to in turn fulfill this mandate. Next slide, please, Brian.
Again, it did it. Okay, how's that?
Yep, perfect. Okay, so for oilseeds, we publish balance sheets for soybeans, soybean meal, and soybean oil in the WASDE each month, but that doesn't mean that we don't pay attention to the use of other vegetable oils, particularly in this case, in the production of biofuels. In fact, we publish, FAS publishes in the production supply and distribution database, the supply and use of canola and their byproducts. So looking at this figure, we can see that soybean oil use in biofuel production has grown over time, particularly for renewable diesel production. Soybean oil use in FAME production, the darker green, it's remained relatively constant, perhaps a bit subdued, as soybean oil use in renewable diesel production has increased over time. Now, in December of 2022, the EPA finalized a pathway for canola oil use in renewable diesel production. And so you can see that around that timeline, the use of canola oil in biofuel production increased quite substantially. And I also want to point out the yellow grease at the top here. This represents used cooking oil. And so we've seen the use of UCO or yellow grease increase over time. And in large part, this is attributed to the structure of California's LCFS program. So basically, feedstocks are assigned carbon intensity or CI scores. And there's a lot of factors that go into the estimation of these CI scores for the LCFS program. But UCO or yellow grease has a lower CI score than pretty much any fat or oil used in the production of these biofuels because it is a recycled oil. It has been used multiple times, and so the impact is less. Okay, so next slide, please, Brian. So how does this all fit into WASDE and the balance sheets we publish each month? So here is we have the current WASDE balance sheet forecasts along with some historical balance sheets for soybean oil. As you can see, soybean oil use and biofuel production has grown substantially over the past few years. We're projecting 11.6 billion gallons this year, 12.5 in the out year, 23, 24. And food and other use has grown for soybean oil, but the largest contributor to the growing domestic disappearance by far is biofuels. So regardless, higher demand, we need higher supply to satisfy the higher demand. And so as you can see, this was not, at least historically, and we're not expecting it to in the future, be offset completely by higher imports. In fact, it's actually higher production that provided the additional supply needed in previous years and in the coming years. And so we all know how soybean oil is produced, and that's by crushing soybeans. And when soybeans are crushed, not only do we get soybean oil, but we also get soybean meal. So the point here is that not only are the domestic soybean oil balance sheets impacted, but also soybean meal. And we could also get into soybean meal equivalents and soybean oil equivalents and the impacts of the meal and oil balance sheets. But we're not going to delve into that into great detail here. Just wanted to throw that out there as something that we also consider and look at when it comes to our balance sheets. So I also have the exports line bolded here. We've seen exports decline, particularly this year in 22-23. The current forecast at 400 million pounds is not quite a quarter of the export volume from just a year ago. Domestic prices of soybean oil have ballooned. A few years ago, they were roughly 30 cents a pound. This year, we're forecasting 64 cents a pound throughout the marketing year. And so even though the apex was in 2021, prices are still elevated. And these domestic prices are in turn represented in our export prices. Next slide, please, Brian. So this slide depicts U.S. and Argentine soybean oil exports and respective export prices. So exports are on the left axis, the volume of exports, and the export price on the right axis. And Argentina is historically one of U.S.'s largest competitors in the global market for soybean oil. But as you can see, prices right now, U.S. prices have a much higher premium than Argentine prices do. And so while, this has happened in the past, we can see this on the graph here. I also want to point out that the largest price differentials have occurred in this current marketing year, a time in which the Argentine soybean crop and therefore their soybean oil supply has been dramatically impacted by a severe drought. So kind of to summarize, biofuel production in the U.S. is largely supported by federal mandates and state incentive programs. The impacts of vegetable oils and fats use in biofuel production is a little more wide-reaching than just the domestic soybean oil balance sheet. For example, other vegetable oil balance sheets are impacted, as are meal and oil balance sheets, not only domestically, but also internationally. I think that's all I've got.
Right. Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you.
So we've already seen lots of impacts that ISIC committees have had to work through, animal disease, Russia, geopolitics, and now I also want to move to transportation and fertilizer markets, not things that we often consider, but they had a big impact over the last couple of years. And so I'd like Angelica to talk about fertilizer
transportation markets. Thank you very much, Brian.
Angelica,
Brian,
I'm
yes.
sorry, I'm getting to the wrong place.
Oh, no. Perfect.
There we go. Angelica
Thank
is International Feed Grains Analyst in Market and Trade Economics Division. Thanks,
Correct.
Angelica.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Good morning, everyone. As Brian mentioned, I'm a feed grain analyst, and been working for ERS for a couple of years on the feed grains team, and I'm part of the ISIC committee for feed grains. So today I'm gonna talk about fertilizer and transportation information and the role of this information, the role that it plays in the WASDE discussions. Next, please. Thank you. So fertilizer is a critical input in the production of a wide variety of commodities. In the case of corn operating costs, you can see that fertilizer accounted for an average 40% of operating costs. This information, it's part of the data product that we have at ERS, the commodity cost and returns estimates. So it also reflects that other operating costs include services, repairs, purchase irrigation water, for example, and the interest of operating capital. If we break down the corn commodity cost and return estimates, it becomes apparent that the largest portion of the operating expenses are attributed to fertilizers. The second largest operating cost category for corn production is seed. It ranges roughly between 20 to 30% of the total operating cost between 2007 and 2021, as we can see on this chart. So the higher fertilizer prices increase the cost of production of farmers and reduce potentially profitability. Next, please. So if we go back to early 2021, commodity prices were increasing across all sectors in the world economy as the economy emerged from the global pandemic, as we remember. Input prices were not the exception. In this chart, that it's part of the chart of note that ERS published around that time, the fertilizer prices in early 2022 arise significantly, which was a very critical point of discussion that surrounded such an increase. It was a discussion that started heating up around the time late 2021 towards 2022. So in this chart, we use cash prices from Iowa, given its relevance as a key crop producing state for corn and the major feed grains. Next, please. Towards the end of 2020 through 2021, as we can see in this chart, price for fertilizer inputs surged, leading to commodity production concerns. As I mentioned, we use monthly data and we look into the price trends for various forms of nitrogen fertilizer, given it's a critical input for crop production. Prices of each form of nitrogen have also followed similar trajectories since 2012. But in particular for anhydrous ammonia, a concentrated form of gaseous form of nitrogen, prices rose sharply from a 2-year low price near $400 per ton in 2020 to a record $1,600 per ton towards the summer of 2022. So basically, we are talking here about tripling the prices in a matter of just 12 months. So monthly prices of anhydrous ammonia exceeded literally the 5-year average prices in 11 out of 12 months in 2021. So as expected, other key fertilizer prices showed a similar trajectory. So we can say that higher fertilizer prices increase the cost of production for farmers, potentially reducing profitability. Next, please. In light of this rising fertilizer prices situation, many analysts started to speculate about how these changes will influence area planted. There were a lot of concerns, a lot of discussions, and these are just a few examples of articles that you can find that are published in popular ag media outlets about the topic. Also, media reached out to ERS after we published our special outlook report that discussed briefly about fertilizer prices and that related to the subject of the increase of them. Next, please. So with this background, how did all this impacted our projections and the ISEC committee discussion? So the answer to this question is it depends. This is where I really get to demystify the WASDE process. Every month, as my colleagues have discussed, we meet as an ISEC committee and we discuss our models and projections. Every member of the committee, which includes ERS, a market analyst, the Office of the Chief Economist, FAS, and FPAC analysts, join and bring up their models, and we have this conversation about how the models would just impact our balance sheets. However, when it comes to area planted, it is just much simpler. Here, we rely basically on heavily upon data provided by NAS, as Mark was mentioning earlier in this presentation, in the form of the prospective plantings report that is released on March 30th and the acreage report that is released on June 30th. So from that perspective, fertilizers prices don't enter into the conversation per se at all when we are determining the area planted. But does that mean that the fertilizer prices are not accounted for? So the answer to that question is no. Ultimately, fertilizer prices are accounted in a form of discussions in the kitchen tables and home offices of all our producers. That later on it appears in the form of the NAS survey results when they publish their prospective plantings and the acreage reports. So ultimately, as a committee, ISEC does not directly account for fertilizer prices, but we indirectly do by observing the actions that farmers and producers will have through the official data sources and will be reflected on surveys and the information, official information. Next, please. Oh, I skipped that. Wanted to talk about prospective plantings. Next, please. So the next case of study is transportation. Similarly, there are a lot of conversations. So there were a lot of conversations towards the end of 2022 about transportation and the impacts that the estimates will be the estimates that will be released on WASDE each month will be affected by it. A great example of that was the recent discussions on how the Mississippi River levels will affect exports, and the impact of water levels on shipping and exports was a hot topic for quite some time, which we could find and we could read about on the social media and discussions about changes and the impacts on our WASDE estimates. But as you can see here, a few examples of articles that can be found on popular media outlets. However, in this case, I think it's also worthwhile to make a little bit of a story and a description of a step-by-step of a timeline of what went into this transportation issue. Next, please. So here's a figure from our November 5th Outlook report. As you can see, there is no doubt the water levels definitely impacted freight rates in the Mississippi River, but they were higher definitely in 2022 compared to previous years, given the Mississippi River water levels. Next, please. Export commitments were also well below the previous year's pace. Yet, despite all this information, we left exports unchanged for the month of November. However, by December, then we had an additional piece of information of official data in which accumulated exports to date was still trending well behind previous year. In addition to that, please next. US prices were all above the major exporters. As you can see on the red line, it was pretty higher compared to our competitors, Argentina and Brazil prices and Ukraine. So with that additional piece of data, corn exports were lower for the month of December and were lower again for the month of January. So if we next please. Let's fast forward a couple of months later. This is a chart of the March Outlook report where it reflects the accumulated exports to date. In this case, we have a few more months of information or additional data that show that exports continue that lower trend, as you can read on the dotted line, which results in another downward revision in our US corn exports. In this case of transportation, we once again rely upon official statistics that drive our estimates and discussions, of course. Next, please. So in summary, as I mentioned just a second ago, official data is an incredibly important factor when the ASEC committee meets to discuss each month's estimates. From a transportation standpoint and exports, we can observe that impacts through exports inspections, accumulated exports, and global prices. We can look at the pace of exports to date and make comparison with previous years. We ask ourselves questions such as, are we on pace to reach out our projection? We then also discuss and factor in the production variables that we discussed and the supply side and available supply, but also we look at the domestic, not only domestic, but internationally circumstances that go around the world. For example, Brazil, which is also an important piece to take into consideration in the feed grains market. In the case of fertilizer and how impacts we have in supply, we refer to official statistics that are gathered by NAS. Every year, they survey producers about planting intentions, and they release a prospective plantings report and official area planted. So they survey producers again after planting has been finished, and it's released in a form of acreage report by June. We ended up relying upon updated acreage estimate as well. And these reports we have to be taken into account with any planting and considering planting delays. We also go through update, and last minute changes can be inferred or later on published and shared by NAS about the planted area. So in addition, estimates are continually revisited as data becomes available. But ultimately, regardless of the shock that would happen in the market, we always will refer to official data and available data that we have to answer these questions. So with that being said, I appreciate your time and your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Angelica. Appreciate that. We've had a long list of events that have happened in the last few years, and one that continually happens is weather. And so I'd like to introduce Mark Brusberg, Chief Meteorologist, to talk about La Nina.
Thanks, Brian. As Mark Jekanowski said in his opening remarks, there is a group of meteorologists working for the World Agricultural Outlook Board. We, the 5 of us, cover the entire globe, and we look at the weather and climate information, looking for things impacting crops. And one of the things that's caught everybody's attention has been the La Nina. We're now going into an El Nino, so people are pretty well versed in this, but I wanted to give everybody a sense of how we view climate phenomena like La Nina and El Nino sort of through our lens of looking at weather and climate data in particular. Could you go to the first chart, Brian?
I will try.
Yes, thank you. Any given month, the WASDE will reflect a weather story. I'm using an example from several years ago where there was a drought in Russia. We see the same things for Argentina like we did last year. Sometimes we write about crops having a good year, but we always couch what's going on with what is expected climatologically in those areas. Next, please. And here's where we sit in the sort of the organizational structure of the World Agricultural Outlook Board. We report directly to the chairperson, Mark, and his deputy, Bill Chambers, but we work very closely with the ICEC folks. We're constantly talking with them, telling them what we're seeing in key grain, oilseed, cotton areas. And we have this dialogue that we've established where we're constantly informing them of some of the problems, or if there is improvement, we let them know about it to best prepare them for the next issue of the WASDE. Next, please, Brian. Now, we have an agreement with the Climate Prediction Center of the National Weather Service. Any given day, we'll receive thousands, around 8,000 stations worldwide. This is a map really showing a snapshot of what a typical day's data will look like. This is the foundation of our analyses. Next, please. But we're always looking for more. We're always looking to introduce newer, better, high quality information into our analyses. This is one example that I'm showing for Mexico. The left-hand side is showing a satellite rainfall estimate of the precipitation for the first week in April, which should have been the beginning of their rainy season in Mexico. On the right-hand side is rainfall data that we get through an agreement with the government of Mexico. So not only are we looking at things that didn't exist 30, 35 years ago when the WOB was established, but we're constantly trying to stay ahead of the current technology. Could you go next, please, Brian? Here is a newer product, or relatively new product, that we've actually had a lot of success in implementing crop models with. This is a vegetative health index. This is a product from NESDIS under NOAA, a partner agency of the National Weather Service. And this year, we were taking a look at conditions in Canada to see whether or not the initial yields that we were going to propose would make sense, considering how they had done in recent years. And lo and behold, on these types of chart, red is bad, green is good. We saw that, right now, or at the time this image was taken, which was at the end of June, conditions were not great in Alberta. They weren't terrible, but they weren't as good as last year. And that helped to inform our decision on when, where to put our initial yield estimates for Canada. Next, please. We also work with the government of Canada. They're a neighbor, as is Mexico. We work very closely on their drought monitoring system. And as you can see that the Canadian drought monitor for the same period is reflecting that. And it's very important to work with Mexico and Canada because we do produce a North American drought monitor, which sort of zips together the analyses from Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And by working close with the government of Mexico, not only are we confirming what we're seeing with our own weather and climate products for the WASDE, but we're ensuring that there's some continuity along the U.S. border when we're drafting our own U.S. drought monitor. Next, please. Now, getting to the El Nino, La Nina, this is a snapshot. This is from the 1990s, but it's probably the best image I have showing El Nino, La Nina, and it's the cyclical nature of the phenomenon. Where you see blues means this is basically, an equatorial look at the ocean temperature departures from normal. You can see that it's going from La Nina to El Nino, and this is over a period of a couple of years. So it's not a quick moving phenomenon, but is one that we recognize. We've known about this for more than 40 years ago, and we have seen impacts on global weather. Could you go next, please, Brian? Excuse me. Sorry. This phenomenon, with the sea surface temperatures, was famously first identified by Peruvian fishermen, off the coast of South America, but also Sir Gilbert Walker, a noted climatologist, excuse me, found that not only could the sea surface temperature anomalies, predict weather in other parts of the world, that excuse me, there actually is an oscillation that can be measured and calculated and be used for forecasting. Next, please. Excuse me, I came back from Denver with a head cold. This is globally what we would expect. Building on Sir Gilbert Walker's work, we see that this is what is expected during a typical La Nina. And you can see equatorial Africa, South Africa tend to be wetter than normal. Australia, Southeast Asia, wetter than normal. But let's talk about that little dry area on the far right of the screen over Argentina. Of all the areas that I cover, for the WASDE, when there's an El Nino or a La Nina, Argentina usually responds very strongly to the existence. Could you go next, please? And if you look through the years, you can see that during a La Nina year, there tends to be lower yields. And I'm using Argentina corn. This is from our PS&D online database, so you can look for yourself. And what we do see is if there's a series of La Ninas, yields do tend to get progressively worse. We build this into our scenario analyses. It's very difficult to say from one year to another that there is going to be a drought or there's going to be abundant rainfall, because you do see some outliers. But we have a strong indication of not only what might happen, but what producers on the ground are looking at and what their expectations for their next crop is, because, you know, a lot of the more savvy producers in some of these areas impacted by ENSO are going to watch this very closely. Could you go next, please? Thanks. One of the other areas where we notice impacts from ENSO is South Africa. Typically, you know, we've seen some very bad droughts in South Africa during El Niños, but not always. And again, this is the whole rationale of statistically, we might see, you know, this climate phenomena cause the weather to, you know, perform in this way, which isn't usual, but it doesn't always happen. You know, it may be 70, 60% of the time we see these impacts. Now, had 3 relatively good years in South Africa. We're in an El Nino now, and we're projecting fairly typical yields because we just don't know enough right now. They're coming out of 3 good years. We don't expect their, just by rule or by definition, for them to have a very bad harvest, but that's going to be on our radar. Can you go next, please? Australia wheat, the opposite. They tend to have very good yields during La Niñas. El Niños, not so much. They've had some very bad, you know, crops during El Niños. But one of the things to consider is in Australia and in other countries, there's a lot of shifting going on. You know, for example, Western Australia is a bigger producer of winter grains than they were a few years ago. Now, our early season estimate for the yield for the 2023 crop is not necessarily a bad yield, but we're not expecting another bumper crop because there is no La Nina. Next, please. And Brazil, you know, I like to refer to that as the 800-pound gorilla of my crop areas. There really isn't, you know, a distinct, you know, thing to expect during an El Nino or La Nina. And again, that's because of the different climate zones that they grow in, and the crop areas are just so spread out. Next, please. Now, this is an El Nino map similar to the one that I showed for La Nina. And again, this is available online. Typically, we would expect drier conditions in South Africa, drier in Australia. But again, this isn't always something that happens. So far, we've seen good monsoon rain in India and Southeast Asia. So, you know, possibly the, you know, El Nino hasn't really kicked in yet. One thing I can say is, you know, farmers in South America, especially Argentina, have a reason to expect a rebound. And again, we look at this, we sort of put this information through our own, you know, process of telling our ICEC colleagues what they can expect. But again, more importantly, what's being talked about, you know, is just the expectation of an El Nino this year affecting prices. Is it affecting decision making? So while we really don't look at forecasting per se in putting out the WASDE every month, we keep you know, our partners in ERS and, you know, NAS, ARS as well, FPAC, we keep them informed of what's happening with the weather, what the expectations are, and really, you know, what the chatter is all about sometimes. And that's all I have. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you, Mark. That's very, very helpful. And thank you to all the presenters. This has been very helpful to me to understand more about the ISIC process. Does anybody, I'm going to stop sharing the screen. And if all of you could turn on your cameras. Let's have questions from anybody who has questions. Jen left one in the chat, but it wasn't really a question. Let me start out the questions. Angelica touched on this. You know, you've all talked a lot about recent events and how they've affected the markets. And Angelica touched on how you actually worked on this in the ISIC meetings. Can any of you or all of you give a little extra insight into when these things happen? How does that process, how do that new information, how does that affect how you interact in the ISIC meetings? Too broad of a question, I guess.
Looks like Andy's thinking. Go ahead, Andy.
Well, definitely thinking.
You're in those
I mean,
meetings every month. So talk a little bit about the dynamics and how the discussions
Yeah, sure.
unfold and
Mhm. Yeah, sure. But part of it is, anytime there is some kind of development in the marketplace, it's like Todd was discussing, was it, I guess, 2 days ago now,
yeah.
the signal to noise ratio, and you have to try to filter out the noise because there is so much in the marketplace. And, to what extent do certain market players have, like set biases where they're always going to say USDA is too high on this, USDA is too high on this, or, they could take that mentality to, the latest development as it occurs. So you try to figure out, what, in the case of, like Ukraine situation from last year is, what's the real result going to be? How much has already been exported? Do we have a sense of what the alternative routes are? What are the possibilities going forward? And you can have a range of scenarios in your mind, but you can't really hinge too highly on, the high end with the most optimistic assessment of what could possibly happen, or the low end. And, you can only go but so far because we say policy in place. But in the situation where the policies are frequently changing and there's a war happening, you have to just general uncertainty places a large, range of possibilities. And so, you sort of, as an analyst, you can think of, I remember Ed Allen, who was an analyst a long time ago, and he would say something like, you want to put your forecast in a place where you're equally likely to be too high and too low. And, in some ways you sort of balance out the different factors. And then, but then you also have to, you think about, how are we going to explain this in a text? And, ultimately, as economists, a huge part of our job is how we communicate economics to the public. And, you're also, it's hard, like the challenge is, as Todd was discussing the other day, is like, you don't want to overly hinge on what your forecast was, but you have to be able to provide an explanation for why you're changing it also. And that's kind of like the delicate balancing act. So you weigh consideration of what the former situation was, what the range of possibilities are, and, and in the case of like that particular WASDE, explicitly state, what the unknowns are so that your audience understands that.
Todd mentioned on Monday the disagreements that happen, and is that frequent, and is it more frequent and more animated when this new information comes in like this and there's a lot of uncertainty?
I wouldn't say. I mean, I think it doesn't inject undue emotion into the conversation. Let's put it that way. We understand we're trying to cast a light into the darkness, and in terms of the information that's out there. And of course, there's plenty of information, but we have our unique source that a lot of people are turning to. And ultimately, we know that the market looks to us for guidance, but it's also not that the result of an entire war is going to hinge upon what we decide. So, when there is so much uncertainty, it can cast a certain cloud of humility over it, where you recognize, like, hey, if I say 12 and you say 10 and someone else says 11, we're agreeing to disagree in the face of a very hazy situation. And we're all trying, it's like that old story of everyone's feeling something different, but they're feeling different parts of the elephant. And it's only when you put all of your knowledge together does it become the peak that it can possibly be.
That's well said, Andy. Anybody else want to comment on either of those questions? Anybody else feel free to ask a question too, or make a comment?
I think at least for biofuels, like when this new RFS rule came out, like we all have our own methods of going about how we come up with our forecasts. And so we took some time to kind of digest this new, these new mandates and what we thought that meant, come up with our forecasts. And then maybe we have some side meetings beforehand, talk about things that, maybe I missed or somebody else missed, reevaluate, and then come to the meetings and then talk about things. So, there's a lot of discussion, I guess, time to think about policies, right? And how that may impact, then to evaluate, discuss, reevaluate, and then come back and come up with what is, ultimately the best forecast that we have for something like that. And I think that, there are disagreements, but I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing either. Like different viewpoints ultimately help you get to the best forecast. And so it's not like people are mad. It's just kind of like iron sharpening iron. When you come to these meetings, we all have a reason to support what it is that we say, and then we talk about it, and they're like, okay, yep, that makes sense. Let's go with this. So may not be what any one person says, but maybe just like arriving at forecast based off of everybody's opinion.
It gives me a lot of confidence when I see the WASDE numbers now more than before when I didn't know how they were formed, that you have so many sources of information going into it, and you have so many different people with their own perspectives doing, just as you said, Aaron, coming to a conclusion that not necessarily any one person agrees with, but the group has a consensus. That's neat. Jerry, do you have a question or a comment?
I would just say it sort of points out, you can't model for some of these things that happen. They come along, and you can try to find, the last time there was HPAI, and kind of look at what it was that time, and think about what it, how it might play out this time, but we're, assuming, that it will recover. You can look at how it was last time and how it recovered and kind of see something like that. But this HPAI is different than last HPAI, and the Ukraine and Russia war, there's nothing quite like it before, and you'd have to go way back to try to find something like it and how it affected markets. And so, that's a lot of judgment call on that the people that are serving on these committees have to, put their heads together and, try to come up with the most, I guess, a scenario that kind of cuts down the middle, like Andy was talking about, between the very high and the very low.
Good. I'm leaving open the possibility for other questions, but I have lots of questions myself. So my next question is, you've seen all these events. Now you have the benefit of hindsight. Would you have done anything differently, that do you think, in the ISIC meetings with any of these events that we've talked about, or any of the weather situations? And Mark, you've gotten a lot better technology now, and so you have a lot better information, but would you do anything differently as you look back on any of these?
I can say in terms of the the weather group, we are taking advantage of the newer technologies. We're doing more crop modeling. We're working, we have an excellent working relationship with our colleagues in IPAD, the FAS group that's also looking at things like satellite imagery, and they get data. we were looking back, and I think that we are actually more confident now than we were definitely, 10, 20 years ago because of, all the information we have. So I don't know that I would do anything differently, but I'm very proud of the way our group has been able to adopt new strategies based on the new technology. And I'd like to think that 5 or 10 years down the road, we'll be looking back and saying, wow, we were really in the Stone Age back in 2023 with this. So again, we also joke about when we do have a bad forecast, meteorologists and bad forecasts seem to go hand in hand sometimes. But when we give opinions that we sort of regret a year later, you really can't go back and say, boy, I wish I hadn't done this, because, we're working with the best information that we have at the time. So again, I don't know. Like I said, I don't really regret anything other than, maybe if we could have been more at the forefront of getting the technology, but that's about it.
Well, to think about the Ukraine example, like the trade, I showed the one slide because of, where we had progressively raised their export estimate a lot from the initial in 2023, sorry, 22-23. We started at 10, ended up at 16.8. But similar to what Mark's saying, it's like we were using the best information at the time, and there was just such a tremendous amount of uncertainty as to whether or not, like at various times, Russia would be threatening to break off the agreement. And then if that were to happen, then they would be limited to land routes. And, and even now, some of the alternative routes, their attack on the Danube. So, there's so much uncertainty. So ultimately, you try to make sense of it each month. And if you realize that things have changed, the good thing is we do one every month. So we get a chance to update it.
Like for me personally, I think on always ways to improve my analysis, my methods, stay up to date in what's going on. I mean, Todd mentioned it on Monday. You need to be looking at information daily, hourly almost. So, and looking and exploring different ways to model more efficiently, put together better estimates, and always learn, right? Learn of what we have seen. It's a constant process of improvement.
I'll even echo kind of like what Mark said. I'm really proud of our biofuel forecasts. I don't really follow what other people have out there for forecasts because I don't want my opinion or analyses to be swayed. But you can check it, or people will bring it up, and so I think or even phone calls, like by and large, we've been probably the most consistent. We don't change. We haven't needed to change either our forecast very much, and we've been, I think, closer than anybody else in our forecast, those that have been realized and those that will soon be realized. And so very proud of that, because it's, like I mentioned, there's a lot of feedstocks that can be used in the production of biofuels. And if we're honing in on one, maybe a couple with our balance sheet forecasts, it's not always easy. And we do, like Andy mentioned, a lot of people are very critical of our balance sheets, and but that's fine. We've got the reports to justify why we are where we're at, and I'm just pretty proud of how well we've done with at least the biofuel forecast and all the other components of the the balance sheets.
Thank you very much. I got this fire alarm test going on behind me, so I'm trying to keep quiet as I can, but want to leave it open for any other potential comments and questions. And then we'll close in a minute or so otherwise. Well, thank you so much, all of you who presented, and thanks for those who attended. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I appreciate all the expertise that you bring to bear on this process. So thank you so much.